Hey, Bible studiers. Welcome to just a few weeks of focus on the book of Philippians. We're going to take a couple of weeks, and alongside our Sunday series, How to Be Happy, where we're going to be exclusively taking happiness lessons from the book of Philippians because it is such a joy-filled book. We're also going to be taking just 5 minutes every morning to look at the book of Philippians, some of its unique qualities, some of its unique teaching, some of the approach that it contains. And I'm just going to take 5 minutes every day to share one thing with you from that book. So we're going to work through it chronologically, but today we're actually not going to start in Philippians at all. We're going to look at the origins of this church plant, the context that it was birthed into, and we're actually going to start over in Acts 16. In the beginning, when the church was spreading, when the news of Jesus was beginning to infiltrate beyond the borders of Judea and Samaria and the places that we read about in the Gospels, there were people like the Apostle Paul who made it their life's mission to travel around the surrounding areas and take the good news of Jesus to new places, maybe places that have practiced other religions, maybe places that are not familiar with the God of Judaism or the God of the Old Testament, some who have that knowledge in their culture, some who don't. And the Apostle Paul, where we pick up in Acts 16, is trying to go to new places to spread the gospel. He doesn't just want to spread the gospel and let people know about Jesus. He also wants to plant healthy, growing churches so that they'll have a place to thrive and learn good theology. But here in Acts 16, Paul is trying to step into some new territory in Asia, and God is blocking his path. And if we pick up in verse 9, he starts to redirect him to a new place. It says in verse 9, a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen this vision, immediately he sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Macedonia is in a region that we would consider to be far from the ancient Near East portion of the world where the gospel started, where Jesus lived, and actually over into Europe. We now know that territory to be a part of Greece. And this is one of the first mentions of the European church that we have in scripture. And it goes on to say, setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia, and it's a Roman colony. We know that Philippi was actually a significant part of the route between Rome and a lot of her colony countries and cities. And so it was important. It held an important place. And it says, we remained in this city some days, and on the Sabbath, we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. I'm just going to stop there, because what Paul is looking for is he's looking to see if there's any kind of gathering of believers in this city. They would have had lots of other beliefs. They would have worshipped lots of other gods. There were different kinds of influences in Philippi at that time, but he's looking to see, where are the people who know what I know? And what we know is that you had to have 10 men to establish a synagogue in a city, 10 Jewish believers who are male to have warrant for a synagogue in that place. And Paul is looking around for some kind of gathering place of people of faith, some kind of collective worship prayer house is what he's looking for, and he's not finding anything. And so he goes to the river where people would often gather together, and he finds there a group of predominantly women who we know to be those who have already had some revelation of Jesus. Let's just pick up again in verse 13. It says, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and we spoke to the women who had come together there. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia. And what we understand about Lydia is that she listens to Paul's message about Jesus. She believes, she gets saved, her household gets saved, and then she invites Paul and the people that he's traveling with to begin ministering to the community from her household. So you've got the establishing of this church from a woman who really is gathering by the riverside to seek out the things of faith and comes to hear the gospel through Paul. And that's where the Philippian church is established. That's where everything begins. The beginning of this church is one of simple obedience in responding to a vision, simple obedience in Lydia saying, I want to hear what you have to say, simple obedience in then her transferring that hearing and believing to let me be a part of this. And what we know is that the book of Philippians is written 11 or 12 years later. but on the foundation that was established by that simple obedience. It's amazing to see God sending Paul to this group of people. And there's like a real beauty, I think, to the way that his hand is on all of the establishing of this church. This is kind of the context of the book of Philippians. This is where it all started from. And one of the things I love is that if you continue reading in Acts 16, you get an incredible story about Paul and Silas going to prison. They really offend the local authorities by doing something that is considered out of their authority, which is casting out a demon. And they get put in prison for disturbing the peace. But what we know is that when they're in prison, they trust God completely. They start worshiping Him. They start praising God loudly. And in verse 25 of Acts 16, it says, "About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened." Paul and Silas in Philippi were put into prison and worshipped and praised to such an extent that God's attention was focused upon them. There's this earthquake and they get let free from prison. The jailer who is responsible for them feels so terrible about his undone duty that he looks as though he's about to take his own life to save the shame of his failure falling on his family. And Paul says, "Don't do it. Let me tell you what I believe in, and let me tell you why I have hope." And the jailer himself comes to faith. There's an amazing, miraculous foundation for the church in Philippi. This is a place where God has a voice of praise coming out of his people, praise that even opens prison doors. And if you were in the message that we kicked off our How to Be Happy series with, we talked about the fact that our joy is never in our circumstances. Paul here is demonstrating that for us right at the beginning of this church's journey. Here he is in prison in Philippi, worshipping to the point that the doors are opened by some miraculous hand of God moment. And I just love the fact that this is the church that we're going to look at over the next few weeks. This is the establishing of that church. There are miracles, there's joy, there's praise, there's obedience. And we're going to start to take a look at that particular church over these next few weeks. So I want to encourage you, go and read Philippians 1 again. And tomorrow we're going to start taking a look at some of the interesting things that we find in that book. But this is just the context for where it all started. Paul is sent to a group of people and they audaciously, radically believe him. Miracles happen there and the church is established. It's an amazing thing. I'll see you tomorrow.